I'm going to say welcome to our folks watching at home. We're joining you a little bit early. We have folks watching from around the world. That's one of the amazing things about what this pandemic has taught us, is that we can be together in this room with dozens of folks and then also join with folks truly around the world. So we've been really lucky to make feminist community with people on every continent but Antarctica. So if you know anyone on those polar ice stations, we would really like to be connected with them. Thank you all so much for being with us. We are really, really excited to be kicking off the school year at Agnes College. We are really excited to be celebrating new work by Agnes Scott College professors. So we're here tonight in conjunction with Agnes Scott College, welcoming Dr. Mona Tajali in conversation with Dr. Roshan Paul for a discussion of women's political representation in Iran and Turkey, demanding a seat at the table. So first, I will introduce Mona Tajali, who is an associate professor of international relations and women's gender and sexuality studies at Agnes Scott College. Her areas of expertise are gender and politics, human rights, and social movements in Muslim countries. She is the author of the book we're celebrating tonight, Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, which investigates how religious and cultural norms, attitudes, institutional structures, and voter behavior affect the representation of women and quality of democracy in Muslim contexts, with a comparative focus on Iran and Turkey. Her first book, Electoral Politics, Making Quotas Work for Women, co-authored with Homa Hufar, has been translated into Persian and Arabic and is widely used as a training manual for those advocating for women's increased political representation across the Muslim world. She publishes her research findings in both academic and popular outlets, among them the Middle East Journal, Politics and Gender, Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, The Conversation, and The Nation. Tajali has also been a longtime collaborator with the research wing of the Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, and as of 2019, served as a member of their executive board. So please give it up for Dr. Mona Tajali. She's in conversation tonight with Dr. Iqbal, who hails from a small hamlet of 20 million, Karachi, Pakistan. She's received her PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University. Prior to this, she read for her MPhil at the University of Cambridge. She has studied in Pakistan, the US, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, the UK, and Iran. Her research interests include gender and sexuality in the Quran, Islamic law, film and media studies, and modern Muslim intellectuals. Her forthcoming book, which we will be celebrating here as well, is Marital and Sexual Ethics in Islamic Law, Rethinking Temporary Marriage. As an associate professor at Agnes Scott College, she teaches classes in the Religious Studies department and also classes that are cross-listed with women, gender and sexuality studies, and film studies. When she is not working, she loves talking to her family and friends on the phone. Thank you, unlimited phone plans. Tracking fashion, sartorial flourishes are such fun. Watching films, love, love, love. Reading novels, never enough. Painting watercolors, less and less poorly. And cooking new dishes, somewhat successfully. So welcome to you both. Welcome to everyone in the audience. Please feel free to think about questions, and we'll definitely have time for questions from folks in the room as well as folks in the virtual room. But at this moment, please put your hands together for both of these amazing moments.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the audience for their presence. It is late and it is Thursday and I get to. I would especially like to thank Dean Rachel, who honors us by being here, and thank everybody to help us celebrate this important academic contribution. It is my honor and great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Mona Tajali. Before doing so, I would like to thank the many people without whom this talk would not have been possible. People in facilities, people at Charis, especially ER, and Dr. Reem Beidouni and Dr. Scarlett Kingsley. Now to introduce, ER introduced Mona, Dr. Tajali, sufficiently, but I did want to add a little something to her introduction. Not that it's enough that she's written 2 books and she's this amazing sort of international scholar, She's also a mother of two of the naughtiest and cutest boys we ever saw. And noise-canceling headphones have nothing on them. Energizer Bunny batteries have nothing on them. And we would also like to thank Philip, who has also supported her, who is her partner, who has also supported her in her journey. So Dr. Tajali, to start the interview, I'm sure that the audience would like to know something about your academic biography and professional career. What inspired you to study women's political representation? I do recall you saying at another venue that your advisor and mentor, Huma Hutfar, was a great influence and one of the reasons why you succeeded. Since there are lots of students here, and I would love for them to be inspired to create such relationships with Agnes professors, could you also share a little bit about that relationship with us?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to see you guys. I was just telling ER how excited I am that we are in person, but I'm even more excited to see so many of you guys' faces right at the beginning of the semester. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Before I get to that question, I just wanted to take maybe a minute or two to just thank the many, many individuals who made this, us being able to gather here to celebrate publication of a book possible. And that ranges from ER, from many others at Charis Books, the amazing individuals who organized this, Dr. Scarlett Kingsley, Dr. Reem Bailuni, Dr. Roshan Egbal, thank you so much for everything, for putting everything together. And I certainly look forward to our conversation in particular. And also my fabulous colleagues that just supported me throughout the years to be able to finally get this book out, which was a long time in the making. Dr. Kathy Scott has definitely served as an amazing mentor, and she has lent me her pair of eyes many times to look over drafts and proposals. And in fact, just earlier today, I wrote her another hectic email, like, could you look at this? And that, completely unrelated to this, by the way. And she gracefully, she's always been there. So I really hope I'm not bugging her too much with my many things, and my other colleagues as well. Dr. Whitworth is here, and Dr. Hackett unfortunately couldn't make it. Dr. Cochran, Dr. Morris, many others who allowed me to take time maybe away from service to be able to contribute to this publication has been absolutely essential. And unfortunately, Dean Cousins, my former dean, is not able to be here. She also saw the value of me begging for the book to be published as open access. So I'm really excited to have the book be published by Edinburgh University Press as open access. This is the hard copy version, but you can get it for free from Edinburgh's website. And there were many reasons that I worked hard to make sure that the book was published open access. Among them was because this is a book that really is about women's rights movements, women's rights organizers in those contexts, and I really wanted them to be able to have easy access. Also, one of the countries that this research touches on is currently under economic sanctions, Iran, and no one can purchase anything. There's no transactions taking place between Iran and the West. So that was another reason that I really wanted to make sure that individuals there could have access. And also, the pandemic just showed us that we cannot just walk into a library as easily as we would like to. Wouldn't it be better to just have stuff just appear in our mailboxes or on our Canvas sites the way we have them? So yeah, so I just wanted to say I probably left out many names. Obviously, my partner, Philip Frank, has also been an amazing support with occupying our kids while I could attend to this. So yeah, it took more than a decade to write this book, but yes, it was worth it. So with regards to your question of what inspired me to launch into this research. So I come from an interdisciplinary background, and I see a lot of value in that interdisciplinary research. My BA is in political science from the University of Florida. For my master's, which happened to be at the height of the US occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, I opted to go to University of Manchester, where I did my master's on Iranian women's rights movements. And there I got to learn about a pretty cool academic, Huma Hutfar, who happened to be the student of my supervisor at Manchester. So she was also at one point in Manchester. And then I followed her to Canada. And I started to do my PhD with her in interdisciplinary field. She's an anthropologist. So she does a lot of work with ethnographic research, but she's also very much interested in gender and politics. And from there, 2 years into our my PhD, she offered if I wanted to co-author a book with her. So that was pretty much a once in a lifetime opportunity for a graduate student, and we did. I had to, which is this one, yes, exactly. So we co-authored this book, which is called Electoral Politics: Making Quotas Work for Women. And it was published by the Transnational Feminist Solidarity Network, which is Women Living Under Muslim Laws. We call it WOLUM for short, that she helped found alongside 8 other women back in the 1980s. So WOLUM is still around, and we published this book. We held trainings on it in the Middle East, in Tehran, in Turkey, in Egypt. So that was a really interesting part of my graduate years, and to have this scholar really mentor me and really take me under her wings and enable me to publish a book with her, to co-author a book with her, that was absolutely amazing. She also really told me about the value of open access publishing, right? So Volume published this book, free, open access. In fact, these copies here right now are free. You guys can pick them up. I have many more in my office. If you ever want one, just let me know and I'll be able to give them out. So basically, the whole purpose is to make academic knowledge accessible to those at the grassroots levels, to those women's rights activists, and that's why there's also a big push to have it be translated into different languages. So we have it available as Farsi and in Arabic, and the Turkish and the Bahasa versions are forthcoming. So that was my sort of way of getting into recognizing the significance of women's rights movements, that bottom-up push. And while I was working with Homa Farah on gender and politics, I really realized that I was very much interested in women's political representation. And a big push for that was because I was reading in Western literature how, women in the Muslim world are victims. Women in the Muslim world are silent. Women in the Muslim world are absent from political decision-making, from politics. Maybe they're not interested in politics. Their context is just too patriarchal. It's just too misogynistic. And that was not necessarily what I was seeing. When I was on the ground, when I was talking to my family members, being as an Iranian, I was saying that in fact they're very political. Not only are they political, they're politicized, they're mobilized, they push for change, they have zero tolerance for gender discriminatory policies, they're on the ground fighting for this on a day-by-day basis. So there was really this sort of duality that I was seeing between what I was reading in the West literature about women in the Muslim world and what I was seeing on the ground. So that's where we really try to push for, so that's where my research interest on gender and politics really took shape.
Thank you, Mona. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, one's origin story kind of explains how one comes to this academic, the topic that one does come to. So before we get into the book directly, I'd like to ask you a couple of broad questions on your topic. But even before that, let us start with your findings. Because, the audience, sometimes we have a very small brain span. So I just want everyone to not leave here without sort of the most important contributions of your book. So could you tell the audience what were the 3 things that surprised you by your research? Or put it another way, what do you think is the main contribution of this book to the field of gender and politics?
Yes.
I hope my students are taking notes. Important moment right now.
Yes, the surprising part is always very interesting, and I already touched about that. So one thing that was quite surprising just from the get-go was how heterogeneous the Muslim world is, how there's really not a monolith of anything. Definitely women are not a monolith. You cannot box them into any type of category. And as well, institutions, political structures, political parties. So that's one of the things that I really try to push forward in my book, is that while we like to box things and to say, this is religious, this is conservative, this is liberal, this is secular, there's actually a lot of dynamism, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity among that. Another one coming out of this is how the more I did research, and again, that's another thing that in Western literature, when it comes to feminism, liberalism, women's rights, often secular women and liberal women are emphasized. Whereas in my research, I really was interested to see, I want to see who is in power. In the countries that I was looking at, religious groups were mostly in power. So I began to study religious women, those who identify as religious, as conservative, maybe even Islamist. And then I saw, wow, you guys are just as heterogeneous as any other group, right? There's, again, you cannot box them just because they tick the box of saying yes, I'm a member of a conservative religious party, automatically my ideology is this. So I saw a lot of diversity and duality there. Related to that, I also saw a lot of dynamism with religious political movements and how they shift throughout times, and how we might think of them as being anti-women. On a lot of cases, when it serves their interests, they're very much willing to discuss, to engage, to negotiate, and to talk to women. And that's how we see these surprising gains in terms of women's political representation that I talk about. It's like the puzzle of the book.
Thank you so much for that, Mona. Before we get into Iran and Turkey, the main subject of your study and the women you study in your research, could you speak to us to the significance of women's participation in political systems, so that we have like sort of a general foundation of why one might want to look at particular countries? And could you talk to us about why your book specifically focuses on women's descriptive representation versus the two other kinds, which are women's substantive representation and women's symbolic representation?
Yes, definitely. So I do get this question every once in a while from non-feminist audiences that would tell me, well, Iran and Turkey are considered non-democratic. Technically they're called hybrid states, right? So they have features of republicanism, but they also have features of authoritarianism. So why talk about women's political representation in an inherently non-democratic context? And my response to that is, first of all, why not? And second of all, that we assume that women's political representation is just adding women in, and in fact, they're not going to have significant contributions. So, and the other part is we also forget about the fact that democracies, United States being one of them, that if we like to call it a democracy, is definitely not representative. It does not have that equal representation between genders, right? So I think this is where, so when it comes to women in politics, we need to recognize that there's been a historical marginalization of politics. There's been a historical, intentional marginalization and silencing of women's voices, and that goes back to suffrage movements. I mean, that's why women just
over time and place. So
exactly.
Not just like the countries that we are sort of told to have a bias against.
Exactly. Yes. And that gap that I also noticed as I was doing the research, I was seeing that, wow, women are really politicized, but they're not able to reach high-level politics. Why not? And when I did the research, I actually realized it's very similar types of obstacles that they face here in the West. They have little access to financial resources. They face discrimination of their male party leaders. Religion ended up being not the number one, factor. Of course, it plays a role, but it ended up being not the biggest factor. And so because I was interested in women's organizing to maneuver within these obstacles, within these institutional, cultural, political, religious obstacles to reach politics, I decided to mostly focus on how do they even want to gain a seat at the decision-making table. Hence the subtitle that is demanding a seat at the table. And that recognizes also that when you increase women's numbers, that's sort of a first step. Mm-hmm. And hopefully the second step would be that you would have women's substantive representation, which is that you actually see those women be able to actually act on behalf of women, to actually propose women's friendly policies. And then after that, also symbolic representation, that it's important to see women in positions of power, because then it goes and inspires others to be able to do this. So that's one of the things that I was able to see in terms of the descriptive and the substantive representation, to be able to see that they actually do follow a trajectory with one another, and it's quite significant to be able to push for both.
Thank you so much, Mona. That was very sort of explained a lot to us. Could you now share with us why you chose Iran and Turkey in particular for your research, and could you say a little bit more about your methodology? And I want to tell everybody that I am wearing an outfit that an Iranian designer made, which I bought in Germany. And because Agnes is so global,
while I'm wearing a Palestinian dress that I got in Jordan, yeah. Yes. In terms of why Iran and Turkey. Yeah. So the reason of why Iran and Turkey. So one of the questions that maybe was the initial part of why I wanted to do this research was in response to a pretty popular book. I think it even won a couple of awards. It's a book called The Rising Tide by Kiba Norris and Ronald Engelhardt, and who are these Harvard political scientists. And basically what they argued is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this rising gender equality, happening across the globe, except for the Muslim world, it's because of Muslim culture. So it's really Islam that's keeping women out of politics. So one of the things that I wanted to do was, well, why not compare a secular country, Turkey, which at the time was, when I started this research, it was a lot more secular, to a theocracy where both of them have low levels of women's political representation. So it was sort of a comparative that I did by design to be able to address this particular question, to really hone in on the role of religion in either hindering or assisting women's access to politics. And as I got deeper into looking at these two countries, I saw that they actually have a number of really good similarities and differences with one another. So both Iran and Turkey have high levels of women's political participation in the sense that women are really politicized, they're mobilized, there's high rates of women engaging in voter recruitment, there's women running their NGOs. When it comes to election time, it's really women are considered to be like the engines of those elections, right? Women are the ones who are knocking the doors, women are the ones who are passing out flyers. So actually parties have been so successful in really using women as their engines, but then when it comes to actually being in high-level politics, their numbers are quite low. They've also both experienced sort of episodes of what we call secularization, extreme secularization, and extreme Islamization, those to different degrees. Obviously, Iran transitioned into a theocracy, whereas Turkey has a very conservative religious political party in power that's increasingly sort of taking that authoritarian role. And then there were also other really important differences with them. Like, for instance, Turkey does benefit from having a long history of organized political party structure. That ended up being a major key in really helping women just get involved into the party system. Whereas Iran, that structure is absolutely weak and it's really not pleasant. So that's where that comparison really came into it. And I just want to go back a little bit more to the descriptive versus the substantive representation part, where although my research was mostly on the descriptive representation, as I began to look to how are women getting in there, I also noticed that there's intentional push to hinder women's substantive representation coming from the parties. An example of that, for instance, is that if you are a woman who has feminist ideals and you've talked about, that let's say you're part of a student organization of your university, and then you are willing to throw your name into the hat to run for a party, if they find your publications and you're too feminist or too liberal, that party will not nominate you, right? Mm-hmm. So this is where I definitely saw that, wow, there's a specific little tolerance coming from these male party leaders for those women who are tending to be outspoken. Another good example of this is a female parliamentarian in Turkey. She was unknown. She was able to serve in the parliament for one term, but then she ended up being too outspoken for the male party leaders of the secular party, which is the People's Republican Party. And then the party leadership just got rid of her after that first term. So these things would definitely let you know that, yes, we're talking about women being in power, but at the same time, you see instances of how substantive representation takes place. And do some of these sound familiar to us? Definitely, right? We do see like, oh, you're too liberal, you're too outspoken, so we're not, so this is where that sort of similarity with the West is very.
And it's a work in progress, so
exactly.
It's a work in progress. So your research looks at the bottom-up approach. Could you tell us the significance of the approach itself and how it impacted your findings?
Yes, the bottom-up approach, every time, this is one thing that always just put me in a bad mood. Every time I would see a news coming out of, let's say you had women's numbers increase in the parliament, or you had a female minister or something like that, then the news would be like, yay to this party. Did you see what they just did? They just nominated X amount of women, or they just had a female minister. The credit just went to the male party leaders, as though one day they woke up and they're like, hey, we need to have more women in power. And what that just did, why it put me in a bad mood, was that it's as though it just ignored the decades of organizing and pressuring and mobilizing that took place on behalf of women to push for this, to really pressure their male party leaders. So then I decided to really take the bottom-up approach to just say, I'm really interested in how are the women viewing their position in politics? How are they engaging with their political elites? How are they pushing them, pressuring them for this change? And what is the response? The response is sometimes very overt, that they would attack the woman, they would arrest her. Sometimes it would be like, hey, come to the negotiation table. Let's see, what do you need? How many seats do you need from the parliament? So that process was actually quite interesting and something that not many talked about. The other part is I really wanted to shed light onto women's political aspirations. I'm not saying that all of the women of Turkey and Iran are obviously interested in politics. They're not, but there's a good number of them who are. And they're systematically silenced. And I really wanted to give credit to say that, hey, this woman just spent 20, 30 years for this political party. She worked her butt off. Now she wants to have a seat at the parliament, but then that male outsider who has maybe 4 years of party experience gets her seat often, right? This would often happen. So I really wanted to emphasize that part of the situation as well. It's like, they really do want a piece of the political pie because they have something to say, but they're continuously being discriminated against. And how are they engaging and how are they pushing against it?
You know, I never thought about it as I was looking at your book, but as you were speaking to me, I thought, yeah, what you try to capture is all these nameless and faceless, supposed nameless and faceless people.
Exactly.
And that's what the like bottom-up approach does.
Exactly, and try not to give credit to the men as much as possible because it's really male party leaders, and I think male party leaders are major gatekeepers to this, and it would be really, and I saw this one. So I researched secular parties in Turkey, and I researched conservative parties, and I researched that they're all the same. Very similar, just like how we say like the conservative and Democrats and the Republicans here are also very similar. Like none of them are taking a bold move on women's issues, except for yes, you did have few instances of exception, like the pro-Kurdish party in Turkey. They've been, because women are just so integral to that party, they do have a truly feminist ideology within the party that is very distinct for the Middle East as a whole. For instance, they're the only party in the Middle East as of yet that has an LGBTQ quota of 10%, right? That's really interesting for them. But yes, they're the minority in the parliament, but yet they're in the parliament, so that's something.
Would you say it's because women have been involved on the ground for a longer period?
They have been, and also as sort of a historically oppressed and suppressed ethnic minority group, exactly. They've just been able to take a lot of that and then just bring it to the political field. And yes, their leaders are now in prison, they're facing extensive oppression. But that was a big part of my research that I wish I could devote more time to, which, I mean, I have a lot of data, I just couldn't squeeze it into the book. That in the sense that you really, sometimes when you have these amazing radical parties, even though their numbers are small, they do make a shape onto the other parties. Sometimes for them, we call them sort of like that competitive aspect. Yeah, the contagion effect.
So you did touch on this a little bit, but I would like you to speak to the perception of the role of Islam. And as I ask you the next sentences, I'll try not to take my eyes out. But, you know, so I want you to speak to the perception of the role of Islam or Muslim culture as patriarchal and subsequently oppressive towards women, and therefore keeping women out of the public sphere. But one of your main contributions, as I understand it, of your book is that it moves away from a mono-causal explanation of the lack of women's representation to illustrate the multiple causes that deter women's participation in politics. Could you comment on this?
Yes. So one of the main things that I want to make clear in the book is that religion of Islam is one of many factors that hinders women's access to politics. It's definitely not the first, it's definitely not the last, it's one of the many, right? Just like conservative religious interpretations could definitely be. And when I did the comparative research between Iran and Turkey, I could really see what is the role of religion in all of this. So Iran, as a theocracy, they actually do have laws that are inspired from these conservative interpretations that clearly limit or hinder women's access to some positions of power. For instance, on women's access to the presidency, one of the qualifications for a president is that you have to be a rajal, which the conservative interpretation of that, you have to be a man, right? So women are agitating, they're like, no, that's your interpretation, it's a man. I consider it to be, you know, anybody that's of sound mind, right? Or so on and so forth. So that's where the debate is. Whereas in Turkey, you don't have these restrictions. So yes, laws that are on the books that are justified in religious terms and conservative religious terms, they are an interest. But then when you got to that, actually talking to the women one-on-one, when you actually got to asked them, those that identified themselves as religious, like in Iran, there were a group of women who are these ultra conservatives. They call themselves Hizbullahi, right? So like we're the party of God. Like all we're doing is to preserve the theocracy. We truly believe in the supreme leader, and this is our job. And then when you ask them, well, you know, the Hizbullah or the conservatives believe that women's primary duty is to be within the home. There's no place for them in the public sphere. They would say, no, that's nonsense. Of course, you know, and so they would get their justification to be in politics from a religious interpretation. So many times I would hear from women in Iran that they would say, one of the reasons I want to be in politics is because I want to follow the line of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the theocracy. And that was very surprising to many because they were like, well, Khomeini was not an advocate for women's rights, but they actually saw that at one point he would come out and say, women and men come into the streets and vote in support of the Islamic Republic. And that was enough for them to say, this charismatic leader was fully in support of my rights, and my husband, my brother, and my political party leader cannot tell me otherwise. I need to be in the party. And the same thing with terms of Turkey, right? It was women of faith did not see any conflict between their faith and being in political decision making. Did they have other conservative ideals when it came to other issues? Probably, sure. So my research is mostly talking about women's access to politics. I had women in Iran who were completely part of the conservative faction in Iran, and they would say women should become supreme leader. Why not? And they were actually agitating for this, right? Although you might think that this is not a reality, but they were having conversations about this. They were actually going to religious seminaries, researching women's contributions to politics. That's a substantive part of it.
Thank you so much, Mona. If I'm capturing it correctly, you argue that women's political representation is impacted by diverse obstacles arising out of the political, institutional, legal, and social structures of their context, much like the context anywhere, including, as we well know, ours. How have Turkish and Iranian groups maneuvered these structures?
Yes, so in a number of different ways. So in fact, because of the fact that in both countries, currently we have the conservatives in power. So both in Iran, we've got the conservative faction that's actually in control of most of the branches of government. And also in Turkey, we know that Erdogan is pretty much calling all the shots. So because you have these conservative factions in power, in fact, conservative women or those who are part of these movements or they were part of these movements, they actually have more leverage and they have more ways to be able to maneuver and sort of put pressure. So for instance, one of the examples was in Turkey was with regards to the headscarf ban. So in Turkey, there was a headscarf ban for a long time that any woman, because of that historic secular legacy of the country, that women wearing the headscarf could not enter into any public sphere. So universities, you could not enter into, the parliament as a public sphere, you could not enter into, or, you know, being a judge and so on and so forth.
Any job in the government.
Any job in the government, exactly. And then you had a conservative party come to power, which was the ruling Justice and Development Party in 2001, and not much movement was happening on the headscarf ban. So one of the things that women of this party thought was like, hey, can we finally lift this headscarf ban and actually allow headscarf women to live freely? And the party's leadership was actually quite hesitant to do so, because in Turkey, it was sort of the headscarf means if you're completely Islamist, and they were just wanted to appeal to the voters to be like, no, don't think of us as being Islamist, you know, we're not. But so one of the things that women did within the party was they dared the party leadership to say, this was for the 2011 parliamentary election, and they said, you either nominate some headscarf women, we've been in this party for more than a decade now, and it's time to have some headscarf women, and the party leadership did not budge. So you had a whole bunch of high-ranking women actually resign from the party and put together a women-only list.
Wow.
None of them succeeded, but they did this in a public move. And in my interviews, it became very clear that, like, we tried to do this behind closed doors. We talked to Erdogan, and we're like, it's time you show a headscarf woman, and he wasn't ready. So we just said, we're going to publicly resign from the party. And that was a really bold move on their hand. And once they did this, then secular women really, their perceptions of the headscarf changed, right? They were like, wow, they're actually standing up against gender discrimination. So they won the support of the larger Turkish women's rights movement. So this is a really good example. And then 2 years later, Erdogan officially lifted the headscarf ban. And then women could then, you know, eventually enter into the parliament with the headscarf. So there were many numerous examples of this that behind closed doors, negotiations were taking place, and then when they saw they were not satisfied, they would just go ahead and take that move publicly. And I think the role of the public is really important here, is because we're talking about countries where the public is also very politicized and mobilized, and you often saw the public actually favor what women wanted, and women knew that. Women knew, so there was an actual female voting bloc that the public could use and say, you either do this or we're going to take your supporters, and that would end up happening in a lot of cases.
Your book puts at the center of its analysis the political activism and struggle of Iranian and Turkish women for human, civil, and political rights. What are the similarities and differences between these two countries and their women movements?
Yes, because of the fact that, as I mentioned, both countries do benefit from having highly politicized and mobilized women's rights movements, there's a good number of similarities. In fact, there's also interactions and exchange between the two countries, right? So there's a benefit to having neighbors, right? So you definitely, there was some exchange between them. So prior to social media, one of their main ways was to have women's journals. These women's journals were a way to sort of debate about women's issues. Women in politics was always at the center of this. And that's also something that really fascinated me, is that I was able to see that both in Iran and Turkey, women pushed for being in the parliament, for instance, as early as the mid-1990s. This is at the same time that the Beijing Platform for Action happened, that said women need to be in the political decision-making, and really put the blame onto governments if women are not there, versus before that, the blame was really put on the women. It's like, why aren't you in politics? And then eventually they say, well, it's because their parties are not allowing them. So then that was a big shift that happened. Other sort of ways, and then with social media, a lot of this was able to take a shape to be sort of on social media, to be able to interact with each other, women's NGOs, all of these ways, and they would borrow from one another. And support each other to some extent. What's really interesting is that government women often had exchanges with one another, and then they would, and on some cases they would disagree and they would publicize their disagreements, right? So for instance, there's headscarf freedom in Turkey now, and in Iran there's not, so the headscarf is mandatory. So when you have the government women be invited from Turkey to Iran, they would say, well, you know, it's great that we're here, but we would like it to be a choice, right? So that's what sometimes they would even like push each other's buttons on these cases, which was quite interesting. And then they would always ask me, as sort of, they always thought like I was some sort of a spy. They'd be like, what do they think of us in Iran? And vice versa, Iranians would say, what do they think of us? And in fact, right after Erdogan removed the headscarf ban, I had some high-profile Iranian women actually come and take my research and say, we need to write about this, and can you write about this, to celebrate their lifting of the headscarf ban, which was all great. But then we were able to push in a lot of like democratization aspects as well. It's like, well, there's also choice. They give them the choice to pick the headscarf or not. So it's interesting to see that this comparative is actually healthy, and it's that transnational exchange. But yes, there should be more of it. I wish there would be more of it. That's a criticism I have to both women's rights movements of both countries.
Well, my next question is kind of related to that, which was that Turkish and Iranian women organize collectively and have created institutions, organizations, and projects that are not yet well known in the Eurocentric world. Tell us a little bit about these organizations, their achievements, and give us names of some of them, or, you know, just...
Yes, that's something that actually became quite prominent when I was doing my research between the two countries. So I started my research looking at back in my master's years was I specifically focused on Iranian women's rights movement, particularly secular or reformist women's rights movements. And one thing that became very pronounced was that I was able to see how Iranian women can come together across the ideological spectrum so easily. And for instance, I can give you guys examples of that. For instance, in Iran, there would be a bill introduced by a conservative elite that would say, hey, let's make polygyny, so one man being able to have multiple wives, let's make it easier for everyone. And that's something where whether you're a secular woman or a conservative woman, you're not going to like that. So then they would quickly come together, they would organize, and then they would lobby the parliament, and it would die, right? So that whereas I was not seeing the same thing happen in Turkey. I was not seeing women come together so easily and so seamlessly across the ideological spectrum. And I think part of the reason for that is because in Turkey, there's been this historical sort of pitting the secularists against Islamists together. And although it's gone better to some extent that, they see past of these identity markers, but still it's sort of a baggage. And also political parties are just so good at putting these women against each other. So I think that's exactly divide and rule. So that was something interesting, that because the theocracy, starting from 1979, women felt like they had one target regardless of it. So they were able to just come together much easily. Whereas in Turkey, it was always like, no, my party is going to take care of me. And then eventually the party wouldn't. But then the women never really unified in the way they should have.
I mean, even as you're speaking, I just find it so amazing that so many women are involved at so many levels.
Yes,
Yes,
very much so. But it's always an uphill battle. Like, I don't want to make it seem like women are politicized and they actually get to have a voice. They're constantly under attack. They're constantly being like surveilled. And as I said, the more outspoken you are, the more threatened you are. The more you toe the party line, they will throw a red carpet in front of you, right? They will say, come on in, yes. Talk about how good polygamy can be. And you actually have some women enter into politics saying polygamy is a savior for women, right? And then it was like, oh my God, where did that come from, right?
So this also is a good segue into my next question, which is, let's talk a little bit about another aspect, that is the Iranian and Turkish women who validate conservative religious thought in terms of gender. What is your reflection on this? What are the reasons for many women to abide by this system?
Yeah, I think the term validate might not be able to capture it. So as I said, so for instance, this Hezbollah woman that I was talking about, who's by Hezbollah, calling herself Hezbollah, she means I'm completely pro the theocratic regime. I will do everything to conserve the role of the supreme leader and so on and so forth. But then when you talk to her, she would say, I can be a supreme leader if I want to be a supreme leader. I have the capacity to be a supreme leader. This same woman, she said that she wanted, so when you're in university, there's these like Islamic groups, Islamic student associations, and they're called the Basij. And if you join these, that means you get a lot of access to a lot of resources. One of those resources, for instance, was computer lessons. And she wanted access to these, and she said, hey, I'm going to join this Islamic group, except that it was completely male-dominated. But that didn't turn her away. She just kept on showing up to that group, and she said, hey, I want those computer lessons. I'm one of you. Just accept me. And the men, it just got so awkward that eventually they had to like acknowledge her. And then once they acknowledged her, like 15 other women came with her. So it's sort of that, yes, you abide by a particular ideology, and in a way it's a political move and ideal that you have, but when it comes to gender, it's a lot more mixed.
Okay.
And that women, again, I do not want to box them, because again, I would meet conservative women who are conservative on so many levels, but then I would meet others who are completely welcoming to many issues, including homosexuality, including us. So I think these shifts and this dynamism is really significant and important. The same way we recognize these shifts and dynamism within our own cultures, right? I mean, we see how ideas change in context and they evolve, and sometimes they open up and then sometimes they go back, right?
One step forward and 3 steps back.
Exactly. It's the same thing over there. It's really what they're exposed to and what they're, and who is willing to give them a platform and let them speak, and who is not willing to let them speak. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mona.
So one other thing, so me coming as a Western educated woman, that also kind of made it complicated for me to really get to what they're thinking, because a lot of times they're like, what do you think of us? Or so sometimes they would want to test me first on my gender ideology before I could find out about theirs, and it kind of would then turn into like this competitive thing of like, yeah, but in a lot of ways, I mean, they were honest, they were, gaining the trust of conservative women was not easy, but the few that I did, I was very pleased with how,
And that's one of the other things I think students might be interested in, how, like, when you do ethnographic research, how forming these relationships is so important. Just like in the classroom, on the ground, in research, you're as successful as your partners, as, the strong bonds that you can create with your partners.
Exactly. The funny story I have about that is when I was meeting with a conservative woman, I often found myself using my children as a way. So like my motherhood was a way to gain access, and then as soon as I would say I'm a mother, but I'm also a researcher, then suddenly like a curtain would just fall, and they're like, really, you're a mother and you're doing this research and you care about us and you care about tell us more. And then the question would be like, who's taking care of your child? And I would say, my partner, and my mother helps everyone. They're like, oh, tell us about your partner. So, yeah.
that was really interesting. As my second to last question, could you tell us more about your future research projects? When will we invite you next to Charis?
Oh, yes. For my next research, as when I wrapped this up, I really realized there's so many other pending questions. And I think once you guys start doing research, you'll see that you get into it, and then there's just going to be more and more questions that you have, right? And then that's in fact the best thing you can do in order to come up. So my next research, I really tried to prioritize substantive women's representation. So I was really interested on what are the types of bills that women in Iran and Turkey are introducing in the parliament. And then one thing I did was when they get to speak in the parliament, on what issues are they speaking? And I saw overwhelmingly when women get a time to speak, they often speak on gendered issues, because when their numbers are just so few, they automatically see themselves as representatives of women, and they speak a lot more than men do. So there's just a handful of women, for instance, in the Iranian parliament, and they speak, 10 times more than the average man. Also, level of education is very different. So you even have sometimes nearly illiterate men at the Iranian parliament, but never do you have a woman below a master's degree. So these gaps are just so interesting for me to see. Who are they? How did they get there? What types of policies do they put forward? And then, of course, my other research that I'm looking more into, which is beginning from my gender quotas as sort of a way to let women in, is I'm looking more and more at the Afghan women's institutions and Afghan women's rights, particularly how they utilize these institutions within the past 20 years, and then where are they going with it now.
Thank you so much, Mona. Finally,
so I don't know when the next book is. In the next decade or...
No, we know soon. Because the first one is the hardest, and then we'll be fine. Finally, just so no one leaves this book talk being unclear about your important contributions to your research, could you tell us your 3 significant findings again?
Yes.
And then I'll open it up to questions for the audience.
Yes, so I think just the dynamism and the heterogeneity of the Muslim context. And I think it's important to keep in mind that I picked Iran and Turkey as sort of case studies, because the same trends I was seeing take place in Iran and Turkey, I was also seeing take place in other Muslim countries, right? So some of the findings that I have, they could be applied to others, including here in the West, right? Certainly with religious women's organizing, I was absolutely fascinated with how they see themselves as agents, and how their agency might not be according to this secular liberal framework, but at the same time, it's in a way to really challenge gender discrimination, but within their own ways. And they also may not call themselves feminists, right? Like that's maybe an identity marker we put on them, but they may completely reject it because of the negative connotations of that term within that context, and also the dynamism of these religious political movements. And I think these movements, sometimes they become more and more conservative. Sometimes they have openings, they have closures, and women are very keen and very careful to know about these openings, utilize them for their advantage before there's a closure.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
Tajali.
you.
Let's give Dr. Tajali. And now I would like to open it up to questions from the audience.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Tajali, for that amazing discussion of your book. Can everybody hear me okay? My question is about class. How does class inform women's political participation, especially in formal institutions?
Yes, class is a good one, and it's a category that I should highlight. Yes, so class within the Iranian and the Turkish context. So oftentimes there's this assumption, so class was also something that you could not necessarily sort of pinpoint or box women into a particular group. And I definitely saw that women coming from different classes had different priorities when it came to women's political representation, when it came to women being, in terms of women's substantive representation, what they wanted to do in it. Do with having access to power. So within the Iranian context, for instance, certainly women belonging to the political parties that are religious conservative, they often come from the provinces, they often are not urbanites, they often come from backgrounds that really have these strong religious training, strong religious aspects. And that's why having access to resources of the state is just so essential for them, right? So I use the example of the woman wanting to be in this computer class is because there was no other way for her to have access to that. The only way she could get access to it was to join her university's Basij group. And then once you get this very amazing, important benefit from the state, then you sort of have legitimacy. You give legitimacy to the state and you sort of want to support it back, vice versa, right? So I think class was a really significant aspect, and I would say to some extent it works in both contexts. In Turkey, it's a lot more diverse, right? Because within the religious faction, particularly the followers of AKP, some of them started as being more of the recent urbanization population, but then eventually they became, to have the ones that are much more powerful, right? So I think the role of class and the intersection of those with gender is absolutely significant of how they're pushing for some of these changes.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I think the question that comes to my mind first, well, many questions, but the first is, you've given us a really descriptive account. I think, having witnessed what's happened with electoral politics and women in this country, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the prescriptive nature of your work, that is, what is its role in terms of activism?
Mm-hmm.
And do you see potential connections for individuals in the United States to make lessons that we can learn from the activism that we see in Iran and Turkey? And I'm particularly interested in whether you see change taking place. Is it grassroots activism that's the heart of this, the engine? Is it proximity to power? What are the mechanisms that we can kind of see operating and maybe potentially adapt for ourselves?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I do see, when I call it that it's an uphill battle, I mean it's an uphill battle, and I think it's an uphill battle for women everywhere to be able to be in positions of power, just because of the fact that it's important to be at the decision-making table. If policies are being decided on women's bodies, maybe women need to be as part of the decision makers, right? Or anything else. And I think that recognition is universal, right? You have to be there. Except that those in power really want to keep the political status quo. They really want to keep themselves there. So in terms of one difference that I am obviously astonished by with the two countries that I look at and the global context and the United States is the role of gender quotas. That in much of the world, in fact, gender quotas, which is considered an affirmative action measure to help create a more level playing field. It's never to say that quotas solve everything, but it's just to give women just a tiny bit of an advantage. That's something that American women are not necessarily talking about. It's not one of those strategies. I feel like that proximity to parties is probably one way. Women are still hopeful that either Democrats or Republicans might be more supportive. Whereas both in Iran and Turkey, although again, none of the countries have any formal form of quotas, both of the women have recognized that with these political systems that we're dealing with, no way are we going to have some men wake up and recognize the significance of women being there. So we really need to ask for more. And they've gotten very close. So both countries have some parties that have either formal gender quotas or informal gender quotas. Even the ruling Justice and Development Party, for instance, has a good number of women in the parliament. And it's because they have these informal quotas that the women themselves, like whenever the Erdogan and his buddies want to put the list together, there's women saying, hey, you need to add more. You need to add more women. And sure enough, they do. So this is one interesting part that I'm seeing. In terms of grassroots activism, I think that's another major thing. In these countries that I'm talking about, there is a female voting bloc that specifically addresses women's issues. They push the candidates to talk about women's rights concerns. I wish this would be more pronounced here in the West, right, where you could actually have a female voting bloc that would say, hey, let's push these candidates across the spectrum to talk about women's issues. And candidates that never even dreamed of having a feminist bone in their body, suddenly they would be forced to campaign on women's rights because women were just so powerful to push them to do this.
We have a question from one of your students, Dr. Tajali. Cassandra C., from your Intro to Human Rights class, asks, could you say more about substantive and descriptive representation among women in the Muslim world? Can you elaborate on the distinction between the two and the internal conflicts that comes with these women who hold these representative positions?
Yes, hi Cassandra. So yes, the distinction, so descriptive representation just means gain more seats, have more women in positions of power. Substantive representation is meaning, it refers to are women doing something on behalf of women, right? So when I use the example of talking about sometimes it happens that you have a woman gain into parliament that says polygamy is the greatest thing on the planet, let's legalize it. That's when you're like, oh no, this is actually a woman acting against women, right? And we've had this happen, right? So that's why I think we really need to be careful and conscious about just adding more women should not necessarily be the criteria, but rather it should be women who are outspoken and who have an interest to represent women's concerns should be there. So in Iran and Turkey, as I mentioned, we have seen women's descriptive representation shift, and we've seen them become higher and become lower. But particularly when it comes to women who will be representative of women's interests, this is when we see the tolerance of the male party leaders just goes down. They have very little tolerance for outspoken women, for women who identify as feminists, for women who might want to address women's concerns that have to do with greater public presence and so on and so forth. And this is really interesting for me that some of these women who do want to have these outspokenness, they come from within the system. They are outspoken, conservative, religious women sometimes. So they're a product of that system. It's not to say that there's some Western outsider. It's from themselves, but they're willing to attack their own peers. They're willing to attack their own colleagues to some extent to say, hey, I thought you were one of us. Why are you, advocating for women's rights concerns? So that's a really fascinating part that I'm seeing happening. And then once you have these outspoken religious women sort of speak on behalf of women's issues, then they gain the support of secular women, then they become even more powerful because they have sort of this electoral support behind them. So it's a very mixed dynamic between them. And that's why some of them do end up being in positions of power, right? Because the community just comes out and votes on their behalf, and they become too popular that the regime just can't sideline them.
Do we have any other questions of folks in the room?
Right here is what.
Right here.
No problem.
I get nervous when talking in the mics, so I start heavily sweating. I was wondering why conservative parties are so popular in Iran and Turkey.
Yes. Well, as it's happened in recent years is because, so for instance, in the Iranian case is because the conservatives have been effective in silencing other competitors that are more liberal, that are more sort of diverse. And in Turkey, it's also true to some extent, although you do have opposition parties come in, the dominant religious conservative party, which is the AKP, has just been so successful in monopolizing power in its own hands. So that's part of this when I talked about that they're hybrid states, is that they have some Republican features, which is that there is elections, there's regular elections, people turn out to vote for them, but those elections are very much engineered, right? Those elections are just between select few groups that were able to pass through the system, and that's regardless of gender, right? That appeals to that happens to men and women. Women have a much more difficult time getting in, right? So if you're a liberal man, you have a pretty tough time getting in. If you're a liberal woman, you could just, it's very difficult, much more challenging, but it happens every once in a while.
So we'll take one last question.
I can just do without the mic.
Okay, we hear you.
It's kind of a follow-up question to the last one that was asked. I know there's lots of discussion recently about establishment Democrats in the United States being essentially functioning as controlled opposition to the Republican Party. Is there like kind of a similar equivalency in Iran and Turkey? Just like a controlled opposition party, I guess.
A control opposition between the two parties, in the sense of not allowing one opposition to get too powerful or too.
like there's like surface level representation of an opposing side, but not actually functioning as.
Right, right. Yes and no, to some extent. Yes, to some extent we do have that, although they know that the electorate, I think, is a factor to keep in mind, right? The electorate in both of these countries are quite powerful, and their faith in the electoral system has left it that even if the conservatives or even if the authoritarian features just want to silence the other part, there's often enough electoral pressure to at least let a few come in so that there's some sort of a representation. This is until recently, however. Unfortunately, these authoritarian features, and I just talked about this last class in my classrooms, where we talked about this democratic backsliding, where that's just becoming much more difficult, right? So we do see this happening where surveillance, marginalizing these opposition voices is becoming a lot more intense and much more worrying. Yeah, and again, this is regardless of gender, but again, women are much more disadvantaged.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
We do have one more question from our friends watching online. This is from Yael Maines. Yael asks, Dr. Tajali, were there any commonalities in terms of the age of women who are active politically? Are they young, older? Also, does political activism of women run in the family from mother to daughters?
Thank you, Dr. Manis. Yes, very much so. Yes, as I was doing my ethnographic research, so part of my research was to do participant observation, particularly around election time. So one of my methodologies was just to follow women on the campaign trails, because I was really interested to see how do they campaign, how do they interact with their constituents, do they shake hands, do they not shake hands? If there's a coffee shop that's male dominated, how do women, go into this? And what I saw that not only are women 10 times more ferocious when it comes to campaigning than men, but also the younger they are, the more energetic they are. And then I also realized how parties are just such geniuses to have these young, ferocious women within the party campaigning. Because so for instance, in Turkey, there's a list system where the party will give a list of candidates, it's a closed list of candidates for a district, and everybody in that district just campaigns for there. And if you're low enough on the list, that means your chances of getting elected are very, very little. If you're higher up on the list, your chances of getting elected are pretty much guaranteed. So the men would usually be towards the top. The women usually would be towards the bottom. The younger women would be towards the bottom because they knew that the women going out there would just be these badasses in terms of campaigning. So as I was watching these, I would see the 20-something-year-olds, 27, 28, as young as that, they would be campaigning, they would go to the markets in Istanbul and they would shake hands, and the male candidates are just, nonchalantly walking behind them. And then I was recognizing that this was, in a way, it's really good for the women, but also it was sort of a strategic use of the women to then garner votes, because she just really wanted to gain as many votes as possible in the hopes that she would get elected, whereas he didn't necessarily have to worry about that. And they would also, in terms of age-wise, they would tell the male colleagues, like, make sure you're behind me, right? Make sure you're walking behind me. And they would say, yes, of course, women should be always up front. So these sort of cultural things was really, really interesting. And I was seeing that older women campaigned differently than younger women did, but the age and the picking and choosing was really strategic on behalf of everyone. And you did have women get very upset and outspoken if they were too low on the list. They would say, this is not fair. I'm still going to do my best, but this is really unfair, and actually call out the party publicly. They would do it to me, but they would also do it. And then the next round, the party would just nudge them by like a couple of seats up, and eventually they would get in.
And this really is the last question. There's a question at the back. Right here. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal, for being such a fabulous moderator.
Yes,
and
thank you.
Dr. Tajali, congratulations on your book. I can't wait to read it. This has been so engaging. My question was regarding something that's really refreshing for me, which is your decentering of Arab voices. And I say this as an Arab, so I'm not disparaging. But so often when we think about the Middle East or the Muslim majority world and feminist movements, scholarship, popular consciousness always goes back to Arab voices, and you chose two contexts of non-Arab majority countries when you could have brought in, Tunisia or fill in the blank Egypt, etc.
Exactly.
So I wonder if that was intentional, and if you could just elaborate a bit about that.
It was intentional, yes, and exactly for the reasons that you just listed. So much of the literature, unfortunately, again, just lumps the Arab world together. as though, they have similar concerns and similar issues, particularly in terms of gender and politics. There's a number of bodies of literature that specifically does that, and I wanted to do the non-Arab world because there are some cultural distinctions between them, but in particular because often these two countries I found they just get lost as well, right? So in a lot of ways, I wanted to sort of contribute to this, but then having read more research work that is very similar to mine, for instance, Aili Mary Tripp has published on the Maghreb and women's political representation. We have found very similar things, right? So that these observations, they do carry across the region, but yes, I was very keen to have two countries that have somewhat similar histories in terms of that secularization and Islamization, but they're also unique in their own ways. They're both very much concerned with being sort of the global the regional leader. So both Turkey has at one point wanted to be the regional leader. Iran to this day begs to be the regional leader. So in those ways, it was really interesting to see, and of course the proximity between the two, geographical proximity, and how women have been able to. So Ataturk and Pahlavi, they've just looked at each other on so many instances that to this day, when it comes to gender and politics and women's rights and state feminism, that's still very much relevant, right? That Pahlavi looked at Ataturk looked at Iran in a lot of ways, and that's still considered sort of an aspect for them to cover.
Let's give Dr. Tajali another. Thank you everybody for coming. This was wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you
Please
all
help
so much.
yourselves to this book, whoever wants some, and I will be able to.
I want to invite folks, there's still food outside, so please eat all the food.
Yes.
And one last thing, which is that on September 14th, we're having another event with Hearts, which is a beautiful organization for their book called The Sex Talk for Muslims. So if you're interested specifically in feminism and Muslim women, come after that. It's going to be here 2 weeks from tonight. We would love for you to join us. Thank you, everyone.